This is unprecedented in the post-Cold War era. Certainly we've had crises, certainly we've had violations of international law, but no one has behaved in the way that the Russians/Syrians have in intentional infliction of human rights violations, killing, mass slaughter, gas in the case of Bashar Assad, and there's been very little international reaction to it, except for an occasional headline. That's very dispiriting.
Syria's war took off like a rocket in early 2011, quickly assuming a ferocious scale and intensity unlike anything we had seen in the Middle East, and it's continued unabated until today. We were caught flat-footed and unprepared, fatigued by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
The war in Syria represents a new low for the international community. We're seeing a war without law, as well as seemingly a war without end. And we're seeing the breaching of some hard-won gains in international humanitarian law to do with the protection of civilians and the protection of aid workers. It's very, very striking that we're living in an age of the bombing of UN convoys, never mind the targeting of hospitals.
Never in our 30 years of documenting attacks on health professionals and hospitals seen anything like what the government of Bashar al-Assad has done to health in Syria. Here, unlike many of the other examples that we've documented, we see a government that is deliberately using a strategy of attacking hospitals, health facilities, medics, doctors, nurses, as a strategy of war.
Syria has been a devastating civil war, and it's been devastating to the people on the ground, but also to our partners and to our staff. I mean, we were, from September to early December, probably losing a staff person every other day.
It's hard to overestimate the longevity and scale of the death, destruction, suffering, and instability of Syria's human tragedy. Since the civil war began in 2011, more than 400,000 people have been killed and millions more wounded. According to the United Nations, more than 11 million Syrians have fled their homes. That's roughly half of the nation's pre-war population. 5 million are refugees, the majority settling in overburdened neighboring states. Frustrated and under increasing pressure, many made a dangerous bid to enter Europe. That continent is struggling with the social, political, and economic strains caused by the sudden mass arrival of nearly 1 million refugees. Many claim the collapse of the medical infrastructure in Syria propelled the mass exodus.
The health facilities, especially the hospitals, are the artery of life. If you don't have hospitals, if you don't have surgeons, pediatricians, if you don't have gynecologists to make the deliveries, you can't live a normal life.
When people don't have a place to seek medical help, when they don't have doctors, they don't have schools, they don't have a way of making a living, they just begin to lose faith in the overall system. And you imagine what it would be like if you lived in a city and you knew there was only one doctor left for everyone. Wouldn't you leave? Wouldn't you want to pick up and go?
According to Physicians for Human Rights, there have been more than 450 attacks on medical infrastructure, hitting some 300 healthcare facilities inside Syria. More than 800 medical professionals have been killed in the conflict. The majority lost their lives through shelling or aerial bombardment. But nearly a quarter were shot, and dozens were executed and tortured to death.
The intention is to make it impossible to reach health care, and the strategy of the government appears to be to see that hospitals and health care in opposition areas are actually the enemy. This is devastating and unlike anything we've ever seen.
The Assad government and Russia have repeatedly denied that the attacks on healthcare are deliberate and systematic.
If there's such attack from the army, it could be by mistake, but we don't have any information that thing has happened. All what we have is allegations, and only in the Western media, not from Syria.
Susanna Sirkin and her colleagues track attacks on healthcare workers. Their research has concluded that the Assad regime and its allies are responsible for more than 90% of the deaths and attacks on the medical community. And although the numbers are much smaller, the Islamic State group and other non-state actors have been linked to the killing of dozens of medical care workers in Syria. The steady stream of attacks on Aleppo and its hospitals became too much for neurosurgeon Rami Kalazi and his young family. They fled to Turkey, but thought it would be temporary. We caught up with him in November of 2016.
I love Aleppo City. I love to be a field surgeon, so I'll try to go back whenever it is possible.
A few weeks after the interview, the Assad regime and its allies launched an offensive to take back the rebel-held areas of Aleppo. More than 1,200 people died, including 600 civilians. Thousands barely made it out alive. Kalazi never returned to the city. Millions of his fellow Syrian refugees are also unlikely ever to return when the war ends, given the scale of destruction of health and other civilian infrastructures. Although the scale of attacks on healthcare workers and medical centers is the most dramatic in Syria, many believe that it's emblematic of a wider development across several conflicts.
The danger is that the breaches that we're seeing in Syria that have been the exception become the norm in conflicts and civil wars. This is a period when there's the danger of vacuum around the world and a danger for the abuse of power by states that are strong enough to do so. The international sense of conscience and consciousness that led to the responsibility to protect in the early 2000s has certainly been eroded. And I think that should give us concern.
We've entered a period of new barbarianism. States and non-states alike across a spectrum of armed conflicts are actively preying on health workers, destroying health infrastructure, and attacking other humanitarians, shredding international norms. A recent study has detailed how this phenomenon has come to encompass 23 countries. We see aerial bombardments, we see the deliberate murder and targeting of health workers, we see the occupation of health facilities by armed groups. We're seeing the complete cessation of multiple health programs, permanent damage to infrastructure, flight of health workers, and dangerous outbreaks of infectious diseases.
The visibility of the MSF flag, the values, the treating all patients, which gave us some sense of safety, some security in these really fluid environments, has really sort of come away as essentially hospitals become part of the battlefield. It's become, in the eyes of some combatants, a legitimate target. And the act of providing medical care to the enemy, once ensconced in the Geneva Conventions, is an incredibly important facet of where we define some sense of humanity amidst all of this chaos, is really getting eroded away.
Historically, NGOs were seen as, good people coming to help, and they were not being targeted. Now we're seeing, not just by the military, but by fighting forces on the ground. If you look at Somalia, if you look at other places in the DRC, in Yemen, we're seeing NGOs becoming more of a target. And the NGO logo that used to be a protection, now actually it's become a target. It attracts attacks.
Beyond the tragedy of the attack itself and the loss of life, it has far-reaching consequences, because it will affect the whole range of communities and population who won't be able to get appropriate medical treatment, and people will die.
Ken Isaacs is a veteran humanitarian worker who's worked in several of the world's deadliest conflicts over the last 30 years, including the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. His organization, Samaritan's Purse, an evangelical aid group, was one of only 3 international humanitarian groups operating in the country at the time.
How old is she?
4 years.
Despite the brutality of the various parties to the conflict, Isaac says Samaritan's Purse was not directly under threat.
They gave us space. They respected us. They may come back and hassle us later about this issue or that issue, but I never felt in that entire time that I was under consideration to be killed, or that they were going to attack us or hurt us.
Isaacs believes that respect for humanitarian workers by many parties in conflict zones is gone.
And now today I look at what's going on in South Sudan, and it's an absolute nightmare. In the center of the famine area, 15 of our staff were targeted and abducted. One of the local armed groups came in through the back of our compound wall, abducted 8 of our staff, went back out the opening, and marched them to the other end of town, where they went house to house and collected 7 more of our staff. They knew where they were, they targeted them. They brought them out, they marched them through the swamp all the next day. Our staff were convinced that they were going to be executed. The issue was not against Samaritan's Purse, but that they didn't want humanitarian people there feeding the people in a famine zone. And so they were trying to drive us out, and I don't understand that logic.
It was